Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC-ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Aaron Syme, founder and CEO of WebRTC-ventures. WebRTC-ventures is a custom design and development agency focused on building live video applications, and we're here to help you take your application live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.ventures. Thanks for joining us live today on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitch, and welcome also to any of you watching a replay of today's event. For those of you with us live, you can ask questions on YouTube or Twitch throughout the stream. For today's episode, I'd like to welcome Professor Karl Stolley from the Illinois Institute of Technology. At IIT, Karl teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on a range of web development topics, including one on WebRTC. You can reach him on Twitter at stolley.dev. And we have, Karl is also the author of Programming WebRTC, Build Real-Time Streaming Applications for the Web, which is currently in beta release with pragmatic programmers. I've got a copy myself. I definitely recommend it. We'll give away a free copy today to one registered attendee who asks a question, so make sure you get your questions ready. Thanks for joining me today, Karl.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. This is fantastic, and I'm always excited to get to talk to you and to talk about WebRTC as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We were almost late starting because we were having a great conversation before we went live. So I have no doubt that this is going to be a great conversation.
Right.
And I think this is a really interesting topic, an important one for us to revisit regularly on the program because our topic today is the state of WebRTC browser support. And it is always changing, hopefully always improving, but at least always changing. So
right.
let's hop into your presentation there.
Sure.
And I'll just move one more reminder to our viewers. You can go ahead and enter your questions anytime on YouTube or Twitch, and we'll see those for the Q&A session later, and you get a chance to win a copy of Karl's book.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out today. Thank you, Aaron, for that nice introduction and for inviting me on the program. I want to talk, of course, about the state of WebRTC implementations in the browser, but just as a short bit of background about me is that my background is in web design and development, broadly conceived. And so my approach to WebRTC is like a, one in a series of web APIs, a super important and powerful one. But the same kinds of things that prove a challenge across the web, regardless of what it is that you're doing. Like when you develop for the web, you're making the worst bargain possible technologically, which is to say that you have absolutely no control over the runtime environment where your software runs, where your web application or your WebRTC app runs. So we need to think about ways to do two things as web developers. First is, which is really the topic here, is to look at what is the state of the implementation in the most recent browser releases. But then the second thing, and the more challenging thing, is to go back a little further and say, all right, great that Chrome has this, or great that Firefox has this. What do we do about someone who's stuck at an older version for whatever reason? And that's where the real interesting sort of engineering challenges come, I think. So these slides are available to be right on your device, so you can either get a sneak peek of what's coming or go at your own pace or revisit these later. That's at ks4.us/webrtc-live. So you can go and either revisit these slides later or follow along now as you prefer. So as with any specification, WebRTC is not now, nor will it in the future, ever enjoy a perfect implementation in any browser. That's just sort of the theory and praxis kind of split that we have, where we've got the sort of theoretically pure and accurate specification, and then we've got the actual implementation of what's shipping in the browser. So there is no sort of golden point on the horizon that we're aiming for, like, oh yes, everything is perfectly implemented and it works perfectly. Like, there's always going to be something that lags, and of course work has already begun on the next edition of the WebRTC specification. So we can all kind of be happy and drawing a deep breath here where we are in this blissful place where WebRTC 1.0 is finalized and shipping, but it's, as with all things on the web, still going to be very much a moving target. And that being said, right now today, especially with the release of Safari 15.4, we've never enjoyed such robust and uniform implementations of WebRTC as what we've got right now. So that being said, there really is no need or excuse to exclude any major browser on the market. I think that, again, I've been working and doing web design and development since like the blink tag was a thing. Not to give away my age, but I grew up in my first days on the web were the first days of the web in the mid to late 90s, and you couldn't hit a site without like, you need Netscape version 5, and of course you can still find sites out there today that will scream at you and say you need, now there was never a Netscape 5, there was only Netscape 4 and 6, but you could still find these finger waggy kind of things. And of course, still we're seeing a lot of products shipped to market, a lot of WebRTC apps that say you should really use Chrome, and that's true. And maybe there are things that you can tune your app to, but there's always going to be that, non-insignificant part of the market that isn't going to be able to run Chrome for whatever reason, or someone needs to use your app in a pinch. They've got a meeting, they're stuck at their aunt's house, someplace, and their own laptop doesn't work, and so now all they can do is use, this ancient version of Firefox. So then, what does your app do in that particular situation? The good news is that even with that sort of mixed record of browsers in circulation, it is absolutely possible to write code that gracefully supports much older browsers. So I'm a huge proponent of progressive enhancement. We start with sort of what is our baseline level of support, and of course, the more ancient we can go in terms of our baseline support, the better, because again, you're talking larger market share, you're talking wider support, and then of course we build up so that the very latest browsers with the very best and latest implementations are also being served from the same code base, and we're not doing a bunch of user agent string sniffing and stuff like that to try to like hack around it. So I'm happy to discuss that and show code in the Q&A if there's interest. But what I want to get to is our actual state of the browser. And I want to start with Firefox, which I think has been unfairly maligned in the industry when it comes to WebRTC. And Firefox has had some lingering things, but a bunch of them have been fixed. We've got one minor, well, actually, this I've got labeled as a major issue. I've changed my mind as to whether I think this is major or not, but we're missing all of our connection-related APIs, particularly the connection state change event and the connection state properties. So you can polyfill this with adapter.js. I still think it's very useful to load up adapter.js. It again covers over these kinds of things, and you can go to the bug tracker here. There hasn't been any movement on this, I don't think, since last November. So we'll wait and see. This does matter for your app if you've got different kinds of life cycles and things like that happen as you're establishing a connection. It can be really useful to have that connection state change there. But again, we can at least polyfill for that thing with adapter.js. A big one that got fixed, this is actually a talk that I gave in a slightly different form this past fall, so it was fun to give a nice update to all this. We were missing set configuration, which isn't important, especially if you're hooking into some third-party service and you need to present a new set of ICE candidates or new ICE servers, rather. You can do that. So rather than having your RTC configuration object kind of like hard coded into there, and once you begin the process of negotiation, you're stuck with it. With set configuration, we actually have a method that allows us to go in there and say, oh, we changed our mind, we're going to actually do these things instead. We are missing still the ICE candidate error event. That's, of course, a stun turn issue, although it's fairly trivial to just use a good old-fashioned try-catch block to catch those kind of things. And then we're also still missing in Firefox the SCTP diagnostic, which will tell you, what transport method we're using in production. Again, these are things that are not deal breakers in terms of being able to establish a connection, but if we do have particular logic that wants to work on particular states like that, there is that still little minor thing. But that's it. That is fantastic news. That is, what we have 3 slides there that talks about Firefox. So that's it. Yes, we can talk about video codecs. Yes, we can talk about a whole bunch of other things that are sort of, around the RTC peer connection object and the process of negotiating a connection. But really, Firefox is as capable as any other browser in the market now for establishing connection, streaming media and data as anything else. Chrome, I do like to say yes, Chrome, because again, in the great story of WebRTC, Chrome is always sort of presented as the hero. It's the one that has the best implementation, and certainly they have led the way. But that again goes back to the very first slide that says, hey, there's no such thing as a perfect browser implementation. And the major one that we have yet with Chrome is lack of support for the blob value on the binary type property of RTC data channels. The binary type is both a readable property, it's also a writable property, so that we can say either we want to use blobs or we want to use array buffers. The technical details around this are probably a little bit more than we need to wade into today, but one of the things to know is that when you're working with file data within the context of a browser, so if you've got an input form and you're allowing your users to upload pictures or send files or things like that, everything in the browser now is handled as a blob data type. And so when you go to send binary data from a file source like that over a data channel, you have to turn that blob into an array buffer. And so you've got to just slice that thing up into U8 int array and pass it along. That does introduce a certain amount of latency, so we can't just send the blob directly and slice it up. We have to do that additional step where we jump into a array buffer. And I can say, from some of the apps that I've been working on, like if we're doing anything where we've got more than one recipient of a piece of blob data that's connected to a call, slicing and dicing that thing up, I always just fall back to the array buffer, because it's not worth the logic and the extra overhead to kind of like track between slicing up these two different kinds of data. Chrome is waiting for the SCTP end data specification to be finalized. There has been very little movement on that for quite a long time. We need this though, because this is going to improve both our send queue and our EOR problems, and it's effectively going to remove the upper limits to RTC data channel message sizes. Those are currently at about 16 kbps, which is not a lot. That's a tiny amount of data. And of course, there's always a sweet spot in an application when you're slicing up data. Like if you have giant chunks, then you can end up with congestion problems and a lot of, issues with error handling and whatnot. But still, like having to slice up an array into, tiny little chunks like that is going to have some latency impact and some other issues. It's worth noting at this point that even though Firefox does support the blob implementation, theirs too is kind of a kludgy little work. I shouldn't say kludgy. They too are waiting for this specification to be finalized, and so there is more of sort of like a wrapper or a workaround with Firefox that's allowing this thing to happen. And the last one, we've saved the most notorious, let's say, for last, which of course is Safari, which is macOS and iOS alike. This has been a thorn in the side of WebRTC developers for so long, especially in the mobile space. You cannot ignore how large the market share is specifically for Safari on iOS. The good news is within the last several months, actually within the last like 6 weeks, we've had some major moves forward here. So as of Safari 14.5, actually, I think that should be 15.4. Is it 14.5? Sorry, I'm gonna have to check my numbers this morning. It's one of those two. It's the most recent release of Safari. And what we can do now is what every other browser has been able to do for at least the better part of 6 years, which is to do argumentless signaling state-based calls to set local descriptions. So we don't have to worry about manually rolling back. We don't have to worry about glare, where you've got one peer saying, hey, here's my STP description, and the other one's like, oh, this is mine. And then, we end up in this state. We do still, of course, have plenty of older Safaris in circulation, meaning that we do have to make manual calls to create offer and create answer and pass those results in a set local description. I cover that in depth in my book, again, because that is a significant thing. Like we're just, there are older iPhones on the market that are stuck at whatever older version of iOS. So we still need to hit the browser that's running on there, and we can do that. And of course, that's especially essential because, as you know, or what I would assume most of you would know, on Safari on iOS, it's WebKit or you go home. There's no other competing browser engine, so we have to work around WebKit at least until such time as Apple opens up to other browser engines. That's right. So there we go. So pardon the error on that last slide. I knew 14.5 wasn't right. 15.4 is what we're talking about. This has also been fixed where we've got no auto rollback or manual rollback. That's been fixed as well. And that means that perfect negotiation now works on Safari as of Safari 15.4. And there's the release notes that you can go to as well. Another big fix, this one was back at sub 14.1, is a correct implementation of the mute and unmute events and event handler properties on the media stream track. This is a really difficult thing. And of course, there's a ton of WebRTC logic, not to mention a ton of WebRTC tutorials and things like that, that deliberately put the add track event on the receiving side inside an unmute event. And the problem is that that event does not fire correctly in Safari going back to 14.1, which means that even though you've added your media to the track, even though it's flowing over perfectly, Safari's never going to hear that unmute event. And so if you don't, if your logic for displaying the video is tied to that, the video is never going to be revealed in the browser. For my own part, I just ignore that unmute event entirely. Like, I would rather have the black empty frame where a video signal is going to go instead of having it flash up out of nothingness. Okay, yeah. So related to this one, and this is a new bug that showed up in Safari 15. It's since been fixed. There was a specific condition that if you had the autoplay attribute on streaming videos, it wouldn't actually autoplay, and so you had to trigger an artificial click event on the play video element. Thankfully, that has been fixed as Safari 15.3, but that's a huge problem because we've still got plenty of earlier versions of Safari 15 in circulation that are doing that. This one has been fixed. This is an argument for why you should do visual regression testing on all your WebRTC apps. You can see here me looking spooked in the early hours of the morning because I've got this weird piece of matting behind me that was happening on iOS. I was never able to figure out if that was a CSS issue, if that was I couldn't figure it out. We just had this ugly black box. Didn't matter what orientation the device was in. But that too has been fixed as of Safari 15.4. So we can all breathe a sigh of release about that. That's all I've got for now. I'm looking forward to talking more with Aaron and to talk about your questions.
Thank you so much, Karl. A lot of great information packed in there. Really appreciate it. And as Karl said, these slides are also available online. Maybe you want to go back to that at one point too, for those who may have missed it earlier. And when we publish this later on our blog at WebRTC.Ventures, we'll make sure to include a link to the slides as well.
Oops, one more.
So I want to talk with you briefly for a moment about what it was like writing this book and what inspired you to do that. And then we're going to go to a little break, a little ad break for just a moment. And I'll remind everybody while we do that, this is a great time to get your questions in on YouTube, on Twitch, on LinkedIn now for the first time. We're broadcasting live there as well. We've got some great questions coming in already. Really appreciate that. And just a reminder that one of our registered attendees today will receive a free copy of Karl's book if they ask a question. So get those questions in. But Karl, take a quick moment and tell us what Pragmatic Programmers. Congratulations on writing with them. Great publisher, lots of great publications. Really admire their work. What's it been like writing that book for them, and what inspired you to do this?
It's been incredible. I've been trying to feel, or I had been at the time, trying to feel for years, worthy enough to write a topic for Pragmatic. I've been reading their books, I'm probably 15, 16 years, something like that. And I just never felt like I was good enough for it. The process of writing them with them is fantastic. You have a development editor who works with you every step of the way. So you've got a constant stream of feedback. But in terms of the actual story of how this thing became a book, there was a few students that wanted to take this class that we had on the books in WebRTC. I think this was in spring of 2019. No, spring of 2020, and I was going to be teaching it that fall. And I love to teach new things up and down the stack. And I'm like, sure, WebRTC, I'll do that. And the first thing I did was like, well, I'm sure Pragmatic has a really good book on WebRTC. Like, I can really, brush up and teach a graduate level course on this. And then I started looking around the market, and I'm like, wow, like the most recent book, this is in 2020. Like the most recent book goes back to like 2013, 2014. I won't name any names, but you go and you get this thing. And it's like, it's 7 chapters of just breathtaking, like historical and theoretical knowledge. And you finally get to this like sad little, hello world grade app. And it's like, that's it. And so, but at that point I was committed. I'm like, okay, I've been here before, done this kind of thing. So I started, diving deep into the spec and, getting a handle where things were, starting to build my own demos. Cause of course, don't like to disparage anybody, but if you've ever gone through, and I haven't checked it in several months, but at least last time I checked, like the Google Code Labs WebRTC tutorials are broken. Like there are literally errors in there that it's do not, don't pass go, don't collect $200 because of these errors that are lingering in there. So I had to write, all kinds of tutorials and extra documentation, things like that for my students, and taught the class. It was, of course, peak, pandemic online instruction, which was great because here we all are at a distance. And as we get to the end of the class, it's like, well, now we can just use this app that we've been building and use it to communicate with each other. And so that was really fun. But then I get to the end of the class, and it's December 2020, I think, at this point, and I'm packing up all the files and everything like that. And I just had this like dumb moment. Well, actually, the day before I had the dumb moment, my wife is like, "You need to relax. You've been working too hard. Just take a day." And so begrudgingly, I relaxed and took a day for myself. But I came back and looked at all this stuff, and I'm like, "This is a book. Like I've got demo code, I've got annotated documentation, I've got a spec that's marked up, and all this stuff." And so I basically, over the winter holiday 2020 to 2021, I wrote both the proposal for the book and the 25, 30 odd pages that would become what's now, I think, the second chapter for that thing. I sent it to Pragmatic, and within 20 minutes, which again, like, I'm used to academic publishing where maybe you get to hear something back 3 or 4 months after you submit it. 20 minutes later, I got this fantastic email from their one of their acquisitions editors who's like, "This looks great. We're going to have a proposal meeting later this week, and I think we can get this in front of it." I was like, "Wow, really? You guys are so nice. Like, you must do this to everybody." And I found out later that's usually not how it works, and so I was very fortunate like that. And so, yeah, within, I think it was by March of a year ago, I'd signed the contract and was off and running. And then I spent most of the summer working on it. And I have had plans all this semester long to like finish it up. And I'm still like 3 chapters from the end, but classes are ending. So I'm looking forward to finishing that soon. So that is the too long version of how this became a book.
Well, definitely the right topic at the right time for sure.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and one of the nice things about getting the beta version from Pragmatic is, although you do still have a couple chapters left to write, there's still a lot of value in that beta version right now that people can get.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, all the core stuff for setting up a call. I mean, really, you can stop after about the 5th or 6th chapter, and you've got really the fundamentals of WebRTC. The things that I'm finishing up now, chapter on user interface accessibility, and it's very data channel centric. I've got one that's just about working with media constraints, which is still a really tricky area in terms of what different browsers are going to do. And then the last one is just a sample, like if you're going to deploy this thing and run your own, at least a stun and turn server or something like that. So we're getting close to the end, and it's less like central material, but I think that in order to finish off the book, that does need to be in there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, speaking of learning how to build WebRTC applications, let's pause for a quick ad break here where we talk about the WebRTC training program we have here at WebRTC.Ventures. And when we come back, we'll get to your questions. So now's a great time to put those questions into Twitch, YouTube, or LinkedIn for a chance to get a free copy of Karl's book. As a viewer of WebRTC Live, you already know how important WebRTC development is to the modern web. Now it's time for you to grow your career by learning to build live video applications and joining our team at WebRTC-Ventures. Go to WebRTC.ventures and apply to join the next cohort of our WebRTC training program. You'll have free access to advanced courses, mentorship from our team, and those who are accepted into the second month will receive a paid development contract and join our team of WebRTC development experts. Go to WebRTC.ventures now and earn your place in our team of video development experts. All right, so we'd love to see you join our team at WebRTC Ventures. Let's get to some questions. We've got a lot of great ones here, and I have plenty myself as well, Karl. So let's see. We have a question here from Twitch to Mani. I see. Apologies. Are there benefits of WebSockets integration with WebRTC? So how do you typically use WebSockets, or what do you prefer to use along with WebRTC on signaling?
I mean, if you can, generally the support for WebSockets on browsers that support WebRTC, I think is pretty rock solid. I am not aware that there was ever a generation of any browser where we had WebRTC, like a workable implementation that didn't have WebSockets. That being said, you just never know what kind of strange network conditions or something. So, most of the time when I'm writing sockets, and I will there is an appendix in the book where I've written a signaling server that is in pure WebSockets. I would much rather use something like socket.io, if only for the fact that it will fall back to, long polling if we have to go there, just because signaling is so critical. Especially if network conditions shift, you want to make sure that that's going to be, that's going to be possible to have fresh ice candidates come across or a different SDP description come across. Like it's so critical to the stack that while I think it's a lot of fun to write a sort of pure WebSockets implementation, again, my perspective as a web guy is you can never, ever have too many fallbacks. You can never, ever have too many weird worst case scenarios that your code is, defensively, and actively working to ameliorate, should that be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Guillermo on YouTube wants to know milestone version 100 of Chrome. Any big changes you're aware of around WebRTC specifically, perhaps with that version?
Mm-hmm. Not that I'm aware of. Everything that I know of that are Chrome's primary shortcomings are the ones that are in this slide. And again, they're all basically around blob objects. Those have not yet been corrected. And I'm not aware that there's anything new that's shipping in Chrome. I do think that as a community, and I should probably do something about this myself. In the early days, and I think it's still there, you can go to the repository from the W3C that had all their test suites, and you could actually just fire those things through the browser and get a really good picture. They haven't been updated for a long time, but I think we need something like that. We need something that's going to really exercise on that stuff, so that we're not individually crawling through release notes and can I use and things like that to figure out what's going on. And as long as I'm throwing out project ideas for ambitious people, the other thing that we really would use that I think would be great is a site that I would call Can I Also Use, where you would say, okay, I'm using WebRTC and I need these particular methods supported, and then that becomes your baseline browser. And then what you would get is basically like a listing of everything else that you can use, whether it's syntactic sugar like async and await, or if it's the nullish coalescing operator, or whatever it is that you need, kind of like figure out like that way for it. So anyway, summer project there. I'm glad to give other people ideas on what they should do.
I like it. Madi on LinkedIn says this is one of his favorite topics. Thank you, Madi. And also asks for a reminder of the name of the book here. So
sure.
Give you a chance. Yeah, plug the title again and where they can get that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's on the last slide of the deck. Let me just fly over here. So the title of the book is Programming WebRTC, Build Real-Time Streaming Applications for the Web. One of my favorite things about working with Prague is that they let me figure out what my cover was going to be. I've written books before and it was just a black box, and the book, you go through copy editing, you go through final peer review, you go through proofreading, you go through all that, and you don't have any idea what the cover is going to look like until you get like a box from FedEx that shows up at your home or at your office, and you open it up and you're like, oh, that's what they decided to do for the cover. Prague, I was like, I got this great idea, because I actually use this metaphor of like the childhood tin cans on a string, and they love it because like this harks back to like earlier covers for Pragmatic that have these kind of very simple, abstract, and kind of almost funny, cheeky kinds of things. I mean, in the Ruby community, there's a book, Programming Ruby, which there's a new edition of that coming out. That is known in the Ruby community as the pickaxe. And the reason it's called the pickaxe is it's got a picture of a pickaxe on the front of it. So I would love for this book to be not known as Programming WebRTC. I would love for this one to be known as, well, you've read the Tin Cans book, right?
The Tin Can.
Hey, read the Tin Cans book. Oh, you got a question about that? It's in the Tin Cans, right?
There you go. I love it.
I can dream. All right.
Awesome. Cohen on YouTube asks, is there any performance or latency impact with the different binary types on the data channels?
Not that I've been able to test and figure out definitively, because ultimately what gets sent over is binary data. The question is what is the package of that? Is it a slice of a blob, or is it a slice of a U8 int array? Where the latency shows up is that if I'm talking Firefox to Firefox, and of course you have to do some. This is some of the fun stuff I've loved writing in the book. Like if you're going to do binary data transfer between two peers, you got to do feature detection on both ends of the browser. And the easiest way to do that is to just go ahead and attach a data channel to the RTC peer connection, and then read that binary data property. If it comes back array buffer, you're dealing with Chrome on one end. If it comes back blob and blob, it's Firefox. So there's a little bit of logic to do that. But if you're doing just straight up blobs, then when you have a file upload event from an input on a form or something like that, you can immediately go to slicing that thing up and sending it along. If you don't have that, then you've got to do an extra step, and you've actually got to take that blob, convert it into an array buffer. So you get latency there. It's not latency in the transfer. It's latency in that moment where you're preparing the thing to send it over the wire. On the receiving side, then you also need to know, okay, this is an array buffer, or this is a blob that's coming in. There's a little bit more assembly required on the receiving side when you're talking about an array buffer. So it's not that one is faster than the other. Although again, that 16 kilobit limit that we have, safe limit. I mean, if you play with Firefox to Firefox, you can get away with bigger ones. That too is a limiting thing, because now we're talking about, all these extra individual events where we're sending and receiving and we're sending and receiving. But really the big thing about latency is on either side of that, where you have to make the conversion back and forth from blob to array buffer and then array buffer to blob.
Makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Jacob on YouTube asks, are there frameworks out there that handle WebRTC calls for multiple versions of browsers for us? I could see that being a great way to handle a lot of these issues.
Yeah, there certainly, whatever code that I can look at from different shops that put out services and things like that, I'm always interested to see what they have in terms of logic for that. One of the things that I've done in the book is I've sidestepped the question of frameworks. And this is maybe the most controversial thing I'll say today, which is that I think on the web in general, not just talking about WebRTC, I'm talking about everything from, styling, user interface, certainly, interaction and JavaScript and all that. We have a reflex to reach for a framework, to reach for a library, to reach for a plugin, to reach and the problem with that is that one, it's really awesome, because I'm just using this framework. I don't have to care about any of this stuff. I don't have to sit there on MDN or can I use and check versions and things like that. The problem is that when we do that, we reduce the collective ability and understanding of developers in general. So it's like, yeah, okay, well, if I'm using framework brand X, this is how you do it. I have no idea what happens when we're talking about the actual browser. And the other part of that is that browsers have gotten so good. Like, I get it. Like, I came up in the era of like Netscape 4 and broken incompatible DOMs and broken I mean, we whine about like, oh, we don't get blob datas everywhere. But back in the day, like in CSS, if you wanted a box that was 100 pixels wide and you added 50 pixels to a padding to it, on some browsers, that would now be a 200 pixel box, and on other ones, it would be a 100 pixel box. That's a big, huge difference. So these are problems that are just part of the spirit of the web. And what I've tried to do in the book, I only use native browser APIs and vanilla JavaScript. There's no React, there's no Angular. It's just pure vanilla JavaScript. Whether you go on to engineer something in pure vanilla JavaScript is totally between you and your maker. But for me, it's like, let's if we're going to really treat ourselves as WebRTC engineers, then we need to at least know how these lower level, and of course the big argument in the spec community is like, is it a high level protocol or a low level protocol? And of course,
Right.
it depends on what you're doing. But we need to know how these APIs work, and we need to understand how they shift. Because even if you are using a framework or you are using a service or something like that, when your application inevitably fails, which it will, for your users, you need to understand why it failed. And yeah, you can file a support ticket upstream, like, we pay good money for your service every month. But you as the engineer, it's you and your product and your company that's going to look bad, right? So if you're able to say, hey, we don't want to mess around with this stuff. Like, let somebody else worry about negotiation and establishing a connection, all of that. But then the question becomes, well, how are you going to evaluate that product? Are you going to just go by their spec sheet that went through the marketing department? Or are you going to actually do that? Do they have frameworks? Do they have, repositories? Do they have libraries you can look at to actually see how that stuff is being executed so that you can make an informed decision? Like, yes, we will use this framework or we will use this one. So I feel like I've gotten 1,000 miles from the original question, but the answer is that don't ignore what you can get for free in the browser. I mean, the best framework that you can use is the one that you don't have to use at all. We get so much now in JavaScript. I know TypeScript is a big thing, and other kinds of transpilers and stuff like that. But it's much like HTML. You can write as precise or as sloppy HTML as you want. The browser will do something with it. JavaScript is the same way. If you want to police yourself into using really strict typing, you can totally do that. And if you don't have to do that either. And that's where I think we really get the art in engineering these kinds of things, is to say, okay, well, what is a team or what is a project are we going to hold ourselves to in terms of particular matters?
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really great point of the importance of learning against the spec, first, so that you really understand what's going on, because it'll help you, even if you are using a commercial framework or an open source framework around it later on, it'll help you understand those problems that you run into better if you've seen under the hood too. So I think that's really important. And Jacob also wanted to give you props for your attention to Firefox in the presentation.
Oh, thank you, Jacob.
So, all right, a couple other questions here. Another also a nice shout out to you here from Guillermo, thanking you for the effort on writing the book. And as we discussed too, it is hard to find good documentation that's up to date. So kudos to you for doing the work and continuing to do the work as you finish the book, because I know these are moving targets, as you said.
Oh yeah. And I've already got a list of things that are going to be going to the second edition. So, and I have talked to people at Prague about like what that's going to be like. So, we'll get this one out the door in a finalized state, and then I would imagine we'll probably see, 12, 14 months go by, and then it's going to be time to crack this thing open again and see what's happening. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Justin on YouTube says, native UI and permissions are another cross-browser problem, particularly for less technical users. Would there ever be a case for standardizing these, i.e. the screen sharing native UI? Yeah,
those are standardized. We do have a standard for media permissions and permissions dialogues. Again, we run into the same issue that we've had with WebRTC for a very long time, which is, okay, we've got a standard, who's actually implementing it? And the problem there is, depending mostly on the underlying operating system, to some degree the browser, but in terms of like, what does this dialog box look like? Must we always use the native one that's attached to the browser? If we do, again, I'm very concerned at all points about things like accessibility. Is it going to be a control that's accessible and whatnot? So there is a standard, and I think this is just a matter where we need more sort of organization within the community to get developers to work with and talk to browser makers and say, hey, we really need like a straight up implementation of this thing, or see some work do it, to make sure that those kinds of lower level things aren't an issue. Because I'll tell you the other thing, and this is something that is not in any spec, regrettably. The worst part of media permissions is not necessarily the different user experiences of, oh, this is what Chrome does and this is what Firefox does. It's the what happens when you screw up and make a mistake. If you get on a site that says this would like access to your camera, and you mean to say yes, but you're sloppy because you got a drink in one hand and chips in the other, and your fingers are greasy, and you click no, you are in for a world of hurt to like go. Where is it? You go open up the browser preferences. Is it in security or privacy? Do I got to go through this long list of other nefarious sites where I legitimately said no, I don't want to do that? So we need some way to programmatically figure that out, be able to flash an alert, and then not have to write browser documentation for users like, oh, if you actually did this, here are the 18 steps to go fix it, and then reload the page and then get asked again. Like that's a nightmarish workflow, right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways that this could get solved, I would think. But that state where you accidentally say no is really hard to recover from. And as we were getting set up for the talk today, with Chrome, after the latest macOS release came out, Chrome kind of went bananas with different APIs that are at the macOS level for doing screen sharing. I mean, I teach my classes online, and I broadcast live every day that I teach onto Google Meet. And the first day I came back, I broke my one rule for myself, which is don't upgrade macOS in the middle of the semester. Even if it's a point release, you're going to regret it. I did it. I regretted it immediately and was not able to share that thing, because then I had to go dig into even deeper things to share just my desktop. I had to go into the operating system preferences and all these deep convoluted levels. And we're all developers here. And when we get caught up on our own, shoestrings with that kind of problem, you can just imagine what it's like for a user who's like, oh my God, they're asking me for my camera to begin with. And that's like a sort of wondrous thing. So we've really got to remember that when we're solving problems and writing documentation, we're usually doing it for other developers. When we're talking about making life better for end users, that's a whole other thing. And that's something that, I think that's a great question. We do really need to talk about standardizing media permissions.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. One more question from our live viewers right now. Mateus on YouTube asks, I know the WebRTC core philosophy is peer-to-peer connections.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about WebRTC as a tool for broadcasting and multiple peers? Do you address that in the book at all?
So I handle not really the broadcast case. I don't think that WebRTC in like a mesh network kind of thing, which I do for multi-peer apps, where we can, and again, it depends on what we're doing. I think that I have two responses to that. One is that we've allowed WebRTC to become conflated with streaming audio and video. But WebRTC is so much more than that. I mean, that's a great feature, but I think that any company and any project is going to necessarily regret putting too much stock in the audio and video part of it. I mean, I don't know about any of the rest of you, but for me, like when the pandemic started and we were doing more things remotely, either in classes or meetings or professional organizations, like it was just a sea of people with their cameras on. And as time has gone by, camera off, camera off, camera off, camera off. So it's like, okay, we can absolutely go to the mattresses and we can work on codecs and we can optimize this stuff within an inch of its life. We can, build a service or subscribe to a service that's going to let us have 10,000 simultaneous callers. But there's always going to be cases where we scale up too fast, or we're not even thinking about what we're doing. Like, it'd be like, hey, if I tell my wife, like, let's go out just for the two of us for dinner. Oh, and she says, great, where are we going? I say, I've rented out an entire banquet hall. Yeah, I could do that. It would be really weird. So even though, we've got scaling problems in WebRTC 1.0, it's a mistake to say, well, we need to be ready for that point when we're doing 10,000 callers at once. It's like, do you? Like, do you need that much? And then, getting to know, like, what do we get for free? Because I think that what WebRTC is to me, beyond like the cool factor of like doing audio and video and having that able to stream, and you don't have to have an interceding server, you're really talking about a protocol that stitches one interface on one part of the internet to another interface on another part of the internet. And that's where I think, if when I'm talking to my WebRTC students and things like that, like the two big areas that I think we're going to see the most innovation come from in the WebRTC space is going to come from data channels, not just for like, oh, let's have a text chat, or, oh, let's, share, pictures from vacation or something like that. But rather it'll be tied to a second thing, which is getting much, much better at our knowledge of synthetic events in the browser. So for example, the chapter I'm working on right now, it uses ARIA roles and attributes. So it is a traditional chat app, because you got to start traditional, but it is meant to be extremely accessible. So you have like a group chat tab, and then you've got individual tabs for, basically snarky back channel, gossipy kind of things between people. But to build an interface that allows somebody who's low vision, let's say, to know, like, okay, there's messages on the group chat, I've got a back channel here with somebody else, this thing is happening to my connection, here's somebody else who's joined the thing. If you just let it run and just have, constant like, oh, user joined the chat and here's the message and blah, 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 it's an accessibility nightmare. And I think that that's been one of the most important lessons of the entire pandemic and moving online, is that we've been able to include a lot more people in a lot more events. And we can't stop now. We can't just be like, oh, let's ditch this like we ditched masks or something like that. But rather say, how are we going to take and learn from that and make sure that we're doing inclusive things? Because again, this is where we have browser native APIs that are so powerful. The ARIA live regions thing, if you go and read one thing today, just go have a read, probably like on MDN or something, but go read about ARIA live regions. They are fantastic. They are, something that you get for free. Like, you don't even have to write any real JavaScript to use them. You just declare the attribute in your HTML, and then, and there's attributes to say, like, okay, how urgent is a message? So if we've got a, live region that's like a list of chat users, well, we don't need to start screaming at the person like, oh my God, Karl joined the chat. Like, we can set it to be polite. Like, that's literally the name, which of course has different meanings in WebRTC. But when there's a break, when there's not a message coming in, when there's not anything else going on, be like, hey, this person joined the chat, and you get it, in the browser, and then also, other APIs that we're getting now, where we've got a stronger tie between the browser and the underlying accessibility APIs that are in operating systems, which are fantastic and only going to get better.
Absolutely.
Way too long of an answer. I'm sorry. I get excited.
No, but I'm really glad, though, that you brought up the accessibility topic as well, because I do think that is really important. And, we could probably do an episode together about every chapter you're writing in the book. And that's probably one we should come back and have a separate conversation about later too, because I think it is really important.
I'd love to do that. Yeah, for sure.
Scott Davis asked, kind of along those lines, is there a good closed captioning story for WebRTC? Any good like examples maybe that you've seen of that, or use case?
That's right now the story is a sad one, which is basically you've got to either subscribe to a service, and you invite latency, because basically, like, if you use something through like Microsoft Azure has a text to speech API, and the problem is that it introduces so much latency, because you've got to sample the audio, you've got to pack it up, and you've got to transmit it to them somehow, which of course is going to then cut into your bandwidth for what should be devoted to your RTC call. Then you wait for them to transfer it, and then they send it back, and then you've got to attach it to your video stream. Now, some of that stuff is pretty good, but some of it is just, it's so laggy that again, we're making we're setting up a situation where you're making someone who is, you know, hearing, putting them at a disadvantage because they're going to be that far behind any conversation. The nice thing is, and the hopeful thing is that there's not an operating system, mobile or desktop now, that doesn't have some kind of native, and in some cases like on chip, voice to text technology. So what we need is to just, one, make sure that there is a, a voice and video alternative, so that, okay, we can't include this person. Let's drop to a text-based chat or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or the second thing is to just wait for these accessibility APIs to come online, so that, the person who's, needs captioning, and it's, again, not even just low hearing people. Sometimes, I've been in meetings where I'm, sitting in a busy train station or something. I need the captions because even with my AirPods in, like, forget it. I just, it's too noisy and too crazy.
Sure.
But you want to be able to jump into the conversation at the right time. So that's a really important thing. But hopefully we'll see that come on soon, and then that'll have a huge range of applications for sure.
Yeah,
So I don't know
absolutely.
if that's
Yeah.
a good story, Scott, but I do appreciate the question.
No, I mean, important beyond accessibility, in addition to accessibility, just with people multitasking as well, having captioning in there. And
Yeah.
Speaking of multitasking, poke a little bit of fun here at Scott, who then put this in the chat and then followed up by saying he accidentally typed the VI command in the
I was
chat.
going to say, does Scott, don't you mean force quit? Don't you want to do :Q exclamation or something like that?
So, Scott, sorry to poke fun at you, but I hope you've successfully exited VI, and appreciate you watching the program as well. And one last question here, and then we're going to wrap up. This has been a great conversation. Gerard asks if, so a very forward-looking question here, good one to close on, is WebRTC adequate for the universe? For the metaverse. Metaverse, I mean, excuse me. Our future universe, the metaverse.
Right. Gerard, I have a deal that I make with students or with people that I consult for, or anything like that, which is to say that I will never make up an answer when I don't know. I will tell you, I don't know. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is it gets me off the hot seat, which is always a good thing to do. Second is that when I do speak, or when I do offer someone advice, or I do write something in a book, I want you to know that I've got a reasonable degree of certainty. I know what I'm talking about. I honestly don't know enough about the metaverse, beyond the marketing materials that we've all been subjected to. So I have no idea what role WebRTC plays in that. My suspicion, given the sort of, huge, we don't name, Meta in particular, but, the tendency on the web has to have, to be, consolidating around these few big players. And so the thing to me is, like, thank goodness for WebRTC, not because of metaverse, but because then we don't need to necessarily use brand X version of video chat, or we need to rely on this particular service. Like, we can roll our own and do that.
Yeah.
So I would say, if Metaverse wants to put WebRTC into their product, awesome. Hope their engineers contribute back to the spec. I hope they make it better for everybody. If they decide to go with their own proprietary protocols and everything else, then I'm glad we've got WebRTC and we don't have to get their permission to be able to stream back and forth to one another. So there you go. There's my little firebrand,
no, I think it's
kind of answer paired with I don't really know.
No, I think it's a good one to focus on the interoperability there as well, because certainly, if the vision of the metaverse comes to fruition, hopefully it's not, a single company, Meta, controlling all of it, but multiple providers and ways that you can connect to it, and different platforms. And so certainly that implies that if you're going to have, like, video chat avatar heads on your metaverse body walking around, then you want some interoperability, you want standards, and so yes, hopefully, I think there's a role to be played there for WebRTC, but certainly I agree, there's a lot that I don't know about that yet either. So, Karl, any other last comments you want to make before we wrap up?
No, I want to thank you for having me. Thank you all of you who've come out to watch this or watching later. WebRTC WebRTC is a really exciting area. It's still, to my mind, a growth area, and it's still really new. Like the protocol itself goes back as a browser API at least 10 years. And yet it's still very early days because, of course, we didn't have a finalized specification. So learn all you can, take advantage of all the different educational and outreach things that are happening. Like that's almost a hallmark of like the best WebRTC shops. Like even if they're, ultimately selling a service, they're trying to build a developer community around it and try to educate people. And so there's good things out there. It doesn't just have to be my book. I'm blogging about this stuff as much as I can too. And of course, while we're in beta release, I should add this part about Prague is that there's open forums for feedback. And I've been really fortunate that there have been readers that have taken the time to say like, I didn't really understand what this was, or, is there a different way to say this, or is this like that? And that helps me tremendously as an author, because then I can say, oh yeah, like let's take and write a sidebar and explain this point, or let's come up with a different example that's going to reach readers. So I consider myself a friendly and approachable person. So you can always jump on the forums for the book, ask for specific things. I thrive on feedback. I want to make the best book that I possibly can, and the best way to do that is not to try to go it alone. So I have relied heavily on my development editor, on the whole little team of peer reviewers that do all the technical review, and there'll be another round of technical review before this thing is finished. But really, it's the feedback from actual readers that really helps me to know how to write this thing in a way that it's going to be useful and be read. So, I guess my closing comment is please, if you read the book, you got feedback, reach out to me either through the forums or Twitter. My email address isn't hard to find, anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Karl. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the conversation today. Definitely do encourage people to check out the book. You can go get your beta version now. Karl will give you some time to finish the book, but then I'd love to have you back for another episode of WebRTC Live. So thanks so much.
Anytime, Aaron.
Enjoyed
this has been great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And thanks all of you for joining us today. Our next episode will be May 11th with Mo Nazarati from Subspace. As always, this video will be available on the WebRTC-ventures YouTube channel and our blog on WebRTC.ventures. You can follow us on follow WebRTC-ventures on Twitch, on YouTube, LinkedIn to be notified of the next live episode of this, or to join our email list. And so please do join us back on May 11th to talk with Mo from Subspace about reducing complexity and latency for WebRTC networks. That's going to be a really interesting conversation as well. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Let's make it live.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at WebRTC.ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services, and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.